You can still find the ruins and remains of World War II all across Berlin today. But among the most famous of those ruins are the remains of the Anhalter Bahnhof train station, once one of the largest and most opulent stations, not just in this city or this country, but on this continent. And you'd be right to think that it was damaged in World War II, but actually a lot of it was demolished after the war because it sat in West Berlin, where they simply didn't need such a large station because they were surrounded by hostile territory. Now, royalty and visiting foreign ministers would have used this train station. A lot of celebrities used it because there was a secret tunnel that would have taken people across the road to a fancy hotel that's no longer there either. It's really a fascinating place. There's loads of stories to tell, but if we're talking historic train stations, then we need to chat with my pal Ilja Nieuwland, who is the author of the Lost Termini of Berlin. We've met him on the channel before, but his book is now also available in German in large format with loads of images in as well. Let's chat with Ilja. Thank you for this. The Lost Termini of Berlin. This is a fantastic book. We've actually talked about it before when you showed me around the Ostbahnhof station. And good news for people who were a little disappointed beneath that video because they wanted the book in German, because that's going to come out soon.
That's coming out mid-October, I think.
2025.
Of 2025, yeah, that's an important point. This is the English version. It's been out since the beginning of this year, and it's a story history of all the big railway stations that used to be in the city of Berlin, or around the city of Berlin to begin with. And also the 10 or so smaller ones that were improvised. There's a lot of improvisation going on in 19th century Berlin in city planning in general. It's a very un-Prussian thing to be proud of, but the explosion of the population was such that was almost impossible to keep track of, and things that seemed very big at the beginning then turn out to be far too small within a decade.
And this is because Berlin just grows so rapidly. So yeah, at the time that this is built, Berlin is still
in the 1840s, so the first station, when it's in the beginning of the 1840s, I think you're about like 500,000. And then when this got built, the big one, in 1880, that's already up to about 1 million. Then by 1920, when the greater Berlin area is amalgamated, that's 2 million for Berlin itself and another 2 million for all the cities around. So Charlottenburg and Schöneberg used to be separate cities, and then they get drawn into Berlin, and then it becomes a sort of huge mega city.
Yeah, and so what that means then is that this was built really only just outside the city of Berlin.
It was. At the time as this is built, like 1841, there's still a city wall surrounding the city, mainly to have people pay tax within the city. So everything entering had to go through gates, so that the goods could be taxed, and it could also be controlled what was going in and out of the city. This is also a time of epidemic, so there's some other reasons as well. And that gate is also the first problem that the Berlin to Anhalt, which is sort of like around Magdeburg and Dessau company, experiences when they're looking for a site to build their brand new station on. They sort of scour around for locations, and the one that they really want is in front of Hallisches Tor.
Yeah, the Mehringplatz, as it's called today.
Yeah, what's now the Mehringplatz. But that's too expensive and too troubling, because wherever you go around Berlin, you have to traverse through areas owned by the army, parading grounds and so forth.
And this is at a time when the military is held in very, very, very high regard.
Very high regard. Going against the military means going against the royals, and that's not something to be done.
If you're running a very big and successful company, that's part of the establishment, right?
That's part of the establishment.
You have to make deals with these people.
Yes, you have to make deals with these people. That's also one of the reasons why all these stations are they always have very ornate royal waiting rooms, just to sort of please all the kings and emperors, but also all the nobility from the surrounding area.
Anyone with a title who needs their ass kissed a little bit.
Exactly, and they do a lot of ass kissing to do that. And eventually they end up here, just in front of the wall. That's the problem, there's a wall. The Potsdamer station, that's that way, about 500 meters, has already had a gate in front of it. Here, there's no gate. There's a sort of, this is actually the longest part of the wall without a gate. So they have to build their own gate, which turns out to be quite expensive. It already was very expensive to get the line over here because of the military and all the parading grounds they had to go through. But especially all the people living on the route from the gate to the Wilhelmstrasse, the center of power in Prussia, know exactly how much the land is worth.
Yes, it's not like they were ploughing into the slums of Berlin.
No.
This was, I mean, possibly the fanciest part of old Berlin was right on the other side of the city wall.
It was the fanciest part. It was also already quite closely built up because the eastern part of the city was even rural, you could say. But this is also entirely built up to a large extent. And this is all houses of the nobility, large palaces, which would later turn into ministries and so forth, with large gardens. And you had to buy your way through all those gardens.
Oh yes, okay, so a very pricey business. And that's just to build the 1840 version?
That is the 1840 version, which was also conceptualized much grander than it actually turned out to be.
Okay.
Because of all these additional costs.
Yeah. People will possibly know that there's a larger, opulent, more famous version built later, but there's one in between.
There's one in between. It's that way, about a kilometer. It was a temporary construction made out of a sort of this mock half timber style to give some association with the countryside. But it's also quite far away. They have to use that.
So they've put up a temporary building because they have decided...
They want to tear this down and build a new one. And much grander, the grandest station in the entire city. One of the largest station halls in the world at the time. I think only Kansas City and London St Pancras are larger at that point.
So the largest in continental Europe?
At least the largest in continental Europe. And crucially, 2 meters wider than the main boulevard of Berlin, Unter den Linden.
So this is what the newspapers loved?
Yeah.
So they could celebrate it. It's even bigger than our great big boulevard.
Yeah. And also the newspapers are important in this sort of thing because a terminal station is like a placard for your line. It's marketing towards the city. And in that sense, it even helps that it is slightly outside because it also gives this sort of window between the wall and the station.
So it creates also a sense of excitement, I would say.
Yes,
because this is where,
so.
for mostly wealthy people, they could either go down to Anhalt and do business.
To Anhalt to do business, but also go on holiday in the Riviera, in France, to Italy, to Vienna. There was also a lot of commuter traffic here as well, but the image of the Anhalter Bahnhof is very much connected to celebrities going on holiday in a time that you couldn't really take a car anywhere, so they had to take the train.
Yeah, that was the fastest and most convenient version of travels.
Unless you wanted to be en route for 4 weeks. So that's what it's connected with, and also with things like state visits. If you want to receive a king from Spain or Italy, you get him over here and you receive him as emperor.
Yeah, they feel fancy.
They feel fancy.
Deck it out with flags and flowers.
Flags and flowers, the honours guard that you can then inspect on the platform. There's actually a lot of photographs of that as well. And it's also something that Berlin sees itself as something it wants to be.
Yeah, a world city.
Exactly, a world city. It wants to rival Paris, it wants to rival London at a time when its population is beginning to rival those cities as well. And if you look at Paris, there these stations like the Gare du Nord, Gare de l'Est are all used as a sort of bookends to these big new boulevards. And that's what the Berliners start to look at. So before this grand building, stations tended to be sort of hidden away, architecturally, but also in their place in the city. And this is one of the first that tries to be as grand, as open, as ostentatious as it possibly can.
But it has a bit of a difficult birth. The newer version.
The newer version has a difficult birth in that it also is built during an economic crisis in the 1870s. The company almost goes bankrupt, and then it has to be slightly modified. Ironically, especially the royal wing becomes a little smaller than it initially planned.
Scandal.
Scandal, but also the insecurity of the railway company is one of the reasons why the Prussian state decides to nationalize all the railways, which then sort of is done in various stages because the railways are just too crucial a resource to be left to market forces.
Yes, right. We need all of these people and things to move around this country.
And we want a bigger royal waiting room, obviously.
The most important part of the story.
So, yeah.
And so when does the grand building eventually open?
This opens in 1880, strangely early in the morning. It's opened by Otto von Bismarck.
At 3:30 a.m. did I
At
read?
3:30 a.m. I believe, and then the first train that is leaving the station then has to be lengthened to let all the people in, because everyone wants to take the first train out of the Anhalter Bahnhof.
Yeah, even if it does just end up in the south of the city.
Yeah,
or the south of the city as it is today.
As it is today, near Zuidkreuz.
Yeah, and
So they then have to walk back. It's a bit silly, but yeah.
But there were hundreds of people.
There were hundreds of people, and a lot of people had to be left behind on the platform as well.
I mean, at 5:30 in the morning, by the time it left, right? I mean, not so bad.
No, it's a lot of sleepy people on the train, I think, which hasn't changed since. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, no trains leave here, but I get your point.
Well, they do underground.
That's true.
And that's an important point here. If you ever were here in the underground station, you might have wondered why it's so big. Well, that's the reason. It used to be the S-Bahn station next to a very large railway station.
And thus, a station that today you can pretty much bank on being as good as empty, actually is one of the larger underground S-Bahn stations we have, much like the Potsdamer Platz station down the road. Same story, right? The next one on.
Yes, it's the next one on. The difference is that one was sort of in a straight line from north to south to the south of the city. They had to build a curve to accommodate the Anhalter Bahnhof, and the curve's still there. So if you're cursing the screeching wheels of the S-Bahn while you're traversing Berlin, that's the reason. And that's also one of its main problems. It's slightly in the wrong place, really, for the city.
There's then a quite cool addition. Everyone loves a secret underground tunnel, and that's at the end of the 1920s?
It's built at the end of the 1920s. It leads up to the Excelsior Hotel.
Which today...
Okay, let's not dwell on that too much. But the whole street was lined with expensive hotel. This was called, at the time, the Königgrätzer Straße. At that time, the wall had already been removed. It used to run in the middle of the road. The wall had been removed. The Königgrätzer Straße is of course mentioned after the victory of the Prussians against the Austrians in the War of 1866. So it's all very much tied into Prussian identity at that time. There were a lot of expensive hotels. The Excelsior was one of the most expensive ones.
For sure. It's one that crops up a lot in the history books as where quite a few celebrities stayed. I know the boxer Max Schmeling, he certainly stayed there for a bit. And when I was reading about him, I read that the idea behind the tunnel was that people like him, celebrities who, don't always want or need all of that attention, could pass from the fancy station into the fancy hotel pretty much unseen.
Yes, and without having to wait for the traffic lights, crossing the busy road
all
that, surrounded by journalists.
1920s, we also get the traffic lights of Berlin. There you go.
Yes.
But then, of course, we move into the 1930s and into the Nazi era. What happens to the station during this time?
Well, not a lot. I mean, one of the things is that a lot of these Berlin stations are sort of being modified all the time and rebuilt. All that much happens to the Anhalter Bahnhof after its construction, apart from the platform being extended and being lengthened. But there's not a lot of real reconstruction going on. What happens in the Nazi era mainly is that it is getting used, especially in war, as the place where people leave to go into exile. That's what it's sort of known for.
So that's people who are maybe at the beginning leaving by choice?
Yes.
And then certainly those who are not sent to exile, but rather sent to imprisonment and ultimately death.
Yes, well, in the beginning, of course, mainly people like writers, musicians, and so forth.
Many of whom will go south towards Prague.
We will go south of Prague, we will go to Paris or to Switzerland to settle outside of Germany. And then during the World War, this is where people were brought in regular trains, it has to be said, to be taken to internment camps in the east of Europe, eventually to be murdered over there. Not so much in death camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, but especially in ghettos.
Although there are about 10,000 Jews that are deported from this station, 50,000 from Berlin in total. Many of them were sent to the Theresienstadt camp.
Yeah.
And actually there's a very difficult story that took quite a long time to surface. This was used for deportations, as you said, in regular trains. Often, as far as I know, they only used third-class trains, right, the lowest they could use. But it's actually where the very last deportation from Berlin took place, and that is 42 Jews who were sent to Theresienstadt, 27th of March, 45. And this is, almost to the day, if not to the day, 6 weeks before the surrender. I mean, this is at a time when the Soviets are amassing their forces quite close to the city, and what this shows you is how dedicated the Nazis were to achieving this ultimate goal, right?
Yeah.
As far as I know, all 42 of those people do survive because it is so close to the end, but they do arrive in a Theresienstadt camp that is plagued by a typhus epidemic at this time.
Yeah.
This then brings us, I guess, in our timeline, we've reached 1945. Before we get into the post-war, though, there's one thing that I've always assumed must be made up about this station. It was so big, it was so opulent, but the Nazis had big plans for Berlin. They weren't scared of demolishing huge parts of the city. What was their plan for this station?
It was planned to remain standing, which is quite something if you look at the plans for Germania, the Welthauptstadt,
right in the
world
middle.
capital. Exactly. These are the big avenue north-south to about where the Hauptbahnhof is nowadays. This was slightly to the side, again, slightly in the wrong place. There were some plans for it, but the most pervasive one was to turn it into a giant swimming pool.
Absolutely nuts. I was very happy when I read that in your book, because it's one of those stories that I've always just assumed was made up.
I don't think it is. I think what might give you the sense is that there's a couple of different ideas being floated around. But what is crucial is that no one really wanted to tear it down. They had no such qualms with the Potsdamer Bahnhof, which was supposed to be wiped out altogether, or various other structures. They tore down the entire diplomatic quarter in front of what is now Hauptbahnhof. But this had sort of a sentimental value to the city, yes, and also sort of symbolism that they didn't really want to tear down something as grand as this. Of course, Nazis were all about ostentatiousness.
Of course. And I mean, I guess when you say sentimental value, perhaps for Hitler himself, because this is where he arrived after taking Paris. I believe that he'd actually flown back from Paris, and this was a bit of a setup, bit of theatre.
Yeah.
But as you mentioned before, it's so close to Wilhelmstrasse, the centre of power in Germany, which the Nazis would then go on to add all of their buildings to. And so he comes from the Anhalter Bahnhof to the new Reich Chancellery and addresses the crowd at what for Nazis or Germans supporting the war must have been seen very much as a high point.
Yes.
They never took Paris in the First World War. Look how powerful we are now. This kind of message.
Nor in the 1870 war.
Right.
There's still a couple of people that might remember that.
Of course, certainly. They would have grown up on those stories at least. So the Nazis wanted to leave this standing, and like much of what the Nazis wanted, they didn't get it. What happened to this building?
It was fairly intact after the war, much more so than other buildings that we still see around us today, such as, for instance, the Berlin Cathedral. Big problem was it was in the wrong place again. Trains started running from the station again in August, or July or August, I'm not quite sure.
But very quick after the war.
Very quick after the war. It was, of course, in a very important part. Then they had to remove part of the roof because of the danger of collapse, but then it sort of stayed as its shell until in the early 1950s. And then the first problems arose because this is in Kreuzberg, in West Berlin. All the tracks and the destinations are all in East Germany.
And so all of a sudden we have one of the largest train stations in this country leading to a place no one either can or maybe even wants to get to.
Possibly people that wanted to get here from those destinations. And that was the problem. From 1951 onwards, it's forbidden for GDR citizens, the GDR has just been founded 2 years before that, to enter West Berlin. Nothing much is done about it at that time. They were going to build the wall 10 years later.
But trains are quite big and obvious and relatively easy to stop.
Exactly. They will stop, and no one wants to get into East Germany from West Berlin. So then it's closed down fairly quickly, but it remained standing for another almost decade. The most probable thing that happened after that is that someone thought they might get a good price for the bricks, and they tear down the whole thing. It's being blown up in 1960.
And that leaves us with just this tiny part.
And that leaves it just before this was going to be removed. There's a huge protest movement at the time who want to resist this, which is only partly successful. And then just before this is blown up, the protest movement succeeds in leaving this standing as sort of memento of the horrors of war. Whereas obviously it's more of the mementos of the horrors of Reconstruction, but that's maybe putting too fine a point at it. And this is now sort of, yeah, it's a sort of weird remainder
vestigial bit of Berlin history,
exactly.
Really. Yeah, it's quite an odd thing the first time you see it as you walk down a street that's mostly filled with new buildings, and then there's just this one old thing here. And what I think most people don't realize when they look at this is just how much bigger it was, how little of the facade is left. But speaking of what's left, there are a couple of things we can find in the area. Should we?
Yeah, let's do that.
Should we go look at them? I think first up this way.
Okay.
So let's head over here.
Well, look at that. This is today's Excelsior Hotel. Not only is it ugly, it's also badly maintained. A poster child of post-war Berlin reconstruction architecture. This is the back of the portico of Anhalter Bahnhof. As you see, it's quite obviously a ruin, but it's a very well-maintained ruin, which tells us something about German restoration ethics. That's also, of course, to preserve it as it is now, but it's also made very tidy. Let's go through here. Now, and what we have down here is a lot of pigeon poop covering, because there's the pigeons over there. And if you look up, you see the ornamental ostentatiousness of the whole thing. And also the size. You have to consider that this was also, the portico was the bit before the station even started. So if this is already impressive, you have to give an idea about how grand the bit behind it would be. Now what is interesting here is also the use of material. So it's also, as a lot of Berlin stations were built in this sort of sandstone tiling material with a lot of detail, and they used this colorization of this yellowish hue along with a lot of red. So the entire station was built with these tiles, using the combination of red and yellow, which made it stand out even more than it normally would have. Let's go that way. What we see here, unfortunately, you can look up, unfortunately, she's headless. This is a portrayal of a female character representing the city of Berlin, Berlinia. On the left side you have Anhaltia, which symbolizes the destination of Anhalt that the station was built for. There is also a rather grand bit with a clock and two flanking statues on the top. And you can see here the year 1839, which is supposed to be the founding year of the railway, which is sort of a fabrication because they didn't start running trains until 1 year later, but still, it's ambitious. Here you can see the railway station up from the side, and it again gives you some idea of the grand scale in which it was set up, but also the state in which it's left today, which is really a bit sorry because of the situation that it's mainly a sort of parking space right now. But what you can also see is the way in which this square in front was created. You have to consider that the old Anhalt Gate used to be over there in the beginning in the 1840s. So it opened this window to properly assess the grandiosity of the station itself. So here we end up at the Exilmuseum. This is one of the plans that is currently running for what has to really be happening to this site. It's a museum intended to honor the people that had to flee from the Anhalter Bahnhof to escape the Nazi dictatorship. One of the problems is that obviously this wasn't a very inclusive group of people, so it's a lot of maybe the wealthier side of society. So there has been some backlash against the whole concept of devoting a new separate museum to a rather elitist group. And the other problem is that whatever you do with this site, and I think they're being pretty careful around that, is something that prevents the reconstruction of the station. And that is something there's still a lot of support for. There are still groups that want to rebuild the station. Now, the problem, of course, with that is what are you going to do with it? So we might go back to the swimming pool. We might have other ideas about that, but the whole idea of entirely reconstructing this grand hall is still technically possible if you get rid of the football pitch. The problem, of course, is also the neighborhood, because it would be a bit like putting cream on a turd, in the sense that it's not really the grandest neighborhood. Again, like a lot of things with the Anhalter Bahnhof, slightly in the wrong place, to be honest. In fact, some of the platforms of the Anhalter Bahnhof have survived, so you can easily go there by going past the Tempodrom, this concert venue, and have a bit of a walk. It's about 200-300 meters, and then you can actually arrive at the place where people used to board their train about 100 years ago. So you can actually visit some of the platforms of the old Anhalter Bahnhof, which is about, I think, 800-900 meters further on from the original portico. And here we are, standing on it. We're almost near the end, or we should be near the end, and I'm of course not going to climb that fence. I would never do something like that. And there are several of them. One of the things about building a very big hall is that you can't easily extend it. So behind the hall, the station was a lot wider than it was inside the hall. There were something like 2 or 3 platforms to either side of the big hall, because it's the only thing where you can increase capacity. And they would stretch all the way back to a canal behind, where a bridge would take the train over the canal onto the south of Germany and the south of Berlin. A couple of bridges have been installed here. There is a virtual tour that you can use, where you can actually have a look at the situation as it would have been around 1940, 1930. And it's been, this is fairly recent. It's been done in a fairly nice way, I think. And I'd advise you to look at this sort of still somewhat hidden part of the Anhalter Bahnhof in Berlin, if you have the opportunity. Oh, there's one more thing I wanted to show you, and it's over there. It's on the other side of the canal. So from those platforms that we just saw, there was a rail bridge going under the U-Bahn here. This is newer than 1945. And then onto the land here again. And here we arrive at what used to be the goods station of the Anhalter Bahnhof. Half of which is still standing, at least the front buildings. And this was also the location of the temporary Anhalter Bahnhof in the 1870s. So here we are at the Anhalter Güterbahnhof, or the Anhalt goods station, which you can see is quite lengthy. Now this was one of the 2 offices. It was a terminal station as well, just like the passenger station. And this office used to be one of a set of 2. So you had one here, one there, that hasn't survived the war, and a connecting bridge between them. And cars could go through the middle and get goods from these halls that are there. It is now part of the Deutsches Technikmuseum, the German Technical Museum, which I can very much advise you to go to. And this is the last bit that's really remaining of the Anhalter Bahnhof. They got it because it was originally also the site of the temporary station that we talked about earlier. But looking at the surrounding, you can easily see why this is not the easiest to reach with behind the canal, and why they decided not to build a permanent passenger station over here. There's a story attached to that of the Dresdner Bahnhof, the Dresden station, which was planned to be something like this on this side of the canal, but in the last instance was sort of pushed into the Anhalter Bahnhof, creating even larger capacity problems for the Anhalter Bahnhof than there were already. If you want to know more about it, I can very much advise you to buy the book, my book, The Lost Termini of Berlin. And let me know what you think about it.
So that means all that's left to say is thank you.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Oh, pleasure. And thank you for watching. And if you're interested in the book, there'll be details down below. See you next time.
See you. actually the longest part of the Berlin Wall without a gate at that point.
city wall.
The city wall, sorry. Different wall. Yes, well, in the beginning, of course, after the Nazi takeover in 1833, it's...
1933.
Oh, sorry, 1933. Sorry, I'm a 19th century person. Because from 1851 onwards, it's forbidden for GDR.
1951.
1951, sorry.